this evening's keynote paper is to be given by Schröter, who is Professor of Exegesis and Theology of the New Testament at Humboldt in Berlin. And it's a pity that Chris couldn't be here, because Chris, as many of you know, very regularly cites Jens as perhaps the key influence on his work, certainly on the work on memory. And you find this from a number of figures in this room, actually. In many ways, Jens is kind of father of the various mamsers of memory present here today. One of the reasons why Chris was very keen to get Jens over here is because a lot of Jens' work, understandably, is in German. And the reception in the UK meant it was slow. When a lot of memory stuff was happening, Jens had been doing this for years. There is now no excuse. We even have his translator in the room. You can, for instance, get from Jesus to the New Testament, early Christian theology of the origin of the New Testament canon, which will give you some flavour of Jens' work. And at the British New Testament Conference, 2 years ago, I think, we had a panel discussion of Jens' work on memory, which is an excellent discussion and very well received. So hopefully we can follow that on here, and I'll hand over to Jens for our keynote speech this evening.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Chris Keefe in his absence, but also the other colleagues here from Twickenham and all those who are busy with the organization of the conference for inviting us and for hosting this conference on a very prominent and important topic. I was invited to give a keynote to this conference, and in this keynote I will diverge in some aspects from what Richard Twickenham has presented before, but this is probably what you expected me to do. So the title is Memory, Theories of History and the Reception of Jesus. And my first part is simply called Memory. In historical Jesus research, since the 90s of the 20th century, memory has experienced a significant career. Although the term was introduced already some decades earlier by Birger Gerhardsson in his massive study, Memory and Manuscript, it was not before the 90s of the 20th century that cultural memory was introduced as a hermeneutical perspective for the study of the historical Jesus. The purpose of this concept is different from that of Gerhardsson. Both primary intention was to provide an alternative to the form critical view of the early Jesus tradition as allegedly molded by post-Easter faith and transmitted in an anonymous milieu of early Christian communities. Gerhardsson's approach was pursued and elaborated further, especially by Rainer Riesner and Samuel Würzburg, who is also here. In their view, memory, with regard to the early Jesus tradition, depicts the way Jesus' teaching was learned by heart and preserved in a school context, for which the Jewish Hellenistic and rabbinic educational milieu would provide appropriate sociological and educational analogies. This preservation of a Jesus tradition would also have provided the basis for its transmission and interpretation in early Christianity, and eventually its textualization in the Gospels. Memory, in this perspective, is therefore conceived as a process that established continuity between Jesus' activity and teaching on the one hand, and its reception in the New Testament Gospels on the other. This approach also plays a role in current Jesus research. Whereas scholars who understand memory as a category to describe the reliable preservation and transmission of Jesus' teaching and activity by his disciples and other eyewitnesses that you have just heard. Accordingly, memory is perceived as individual memory, dependent on the capacity and constraints of the human mind to store the main line and details of experiences. Sometimes experiments testing the long-term and short-term memory of volunteers are utilized to answer the question how the eyewitnesses mentioned in the Gospels collected, shaped and transmitted the teaching of Jesus and the events of his ministry. Even if collective memory is considered within this paradigm, as for example by Jimmy Dunn and Robert McIver, the principal pattern remains the same. Memory is understood in terms of preservation, reproduction, and eventually textualization of the essential contents of Jesus' activity. However, there are observations making it rather unlikely that a reliable preservation of the past can rely on the capacity of human memory to store and reproduce experiences. First, as was pointed out in several studies by psychologists, human memory is vulnerable to what Daniel Schroter, who was already mentioned by Richard Borkham, has called the 7 sins of memory. Memory, according to Schroter, is characterized by transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. Moreover, the human mind tends to conceptualize new experiences according to already existing patterns and to construct the past in agreement with aspects already stored in memory. A construction of history from personal or collective remembrances would therefore, in all probability, not stand the test of critical scrutiny. This was also demonstrated by Johannes Fried in his book on historical memory. Fried deals with processes of preservation and transmission on the one hand, and stabilizing factors as writing and canon on the other. Whereas the former are characterized by variation and adaptation to new contexts, also the latter do not guarantee a reliable preservation of the past, but rather consolidate the meaning of the past for the present. These findings are also crucial for Kenneth Bailey's model of an informed, controlled transmission of the oral Jesus tradition that Bailey offered as an alternative to Gerhardson's model on the one hand and the form critical view on the other. As Theodor Wieden has demonstrated in a critical review of Bailey's examples in memory, individual and collective, not only the details of an event, but also the main line can be altered substantially. In an oral milieu, a story can be told in various ways and adapted to different situations. Memory, individual or collective, can therefore hardly be regarded as an instrument of preservation of actual events from the past. It rather has to be perceived as an adaptation of traditions of the past to present situations and their needs. For the Jesus tradition, this would mean that it was transmitted and adapted to new contexts in early Christianity as a free and living tradition. Second, eyewitnesses can hardly be regarded as reliable witnesses of past experiences. Eyewitness testimony is subject to the constraints of human memory. It is furthermore selective, often emotionally affected and one-sided. This probably also applies to the testimony of Jesus' early followers. Moreover, it has to be considered that the Jesus tradition was translated from Aramaic into Greek, formed according to genres, applied to different situations, and incorporated into the narrative compositions of the Gospels. Wherefore, it underwent substantial changes until it reached the form in that we perceive it in the Gospels. Third, the Hellenistic Jewish and rabbinic school setting can hardly serve as a sociological analogy for the early Jesus movement. It is scarcely conceivable that a level of literacy that has to be presupposed for school education can be assumed for rural Galilee as the primary context of Jesus' activity and the social background of Jesus' followers. Fourth, the claim of a reliable preservation of transmission of Jesus' teaching that would allow to trace back the traditions of the Gospels into the pre-Easter period and even to Jesus himself is based on a model of transmission of written texts and does not consider the dynamics of oral tradition. Even if an oral phase of the Jesus tradition is allowed, the characteristics of oral communication are not taken into consideration by scholars who presuppose a verbatim transmission of Jesus' teachings. As studies in oral tradition have demonstrated, in oral communication, each presentation of an event is an original by itself, determined by the actual communication situation and aimed at the meaning of a performed tradition for the present. Even if it would be inappropriate to maintain a great divide between orality and scribality for the early Jesus tradition, it is likely that it was in a process of constant variation and adaptation to new contexts, even after its first textualizations, rather than transmitted verbatim and preserved in its original settings. The character of the early Christian Gospels supports the paradigm of the Jesus tradition as a free and living tradition. Even the Synoptic Gospels, with their close literary relationship, display a remarkable degree of variation and literary freedom, resulting in individual portraits of Jesus. To trace back the variations of these traditions to eyewitnesses would even prove that eyewitness accounts can hardly serve as the basis for historical reliable transmission. The Jesus portraits of the Synoptic Gospels should rather be perceived as representations of Jesus in later situations of Christianity. These Gospels can therefore be described as transparent narratives, aiming at an interpretation of their own situation by way of creating portraits of the earthly Jesus from a later perspective. The perception of a Jesus tradition as a living tradition is supported in its own way by the Gospel of John, as well as by non-canonical Gospels, as for example Papyrus Edgerton II, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840, the Gospel of Thomas, or the so-called Jewish Christian Gospels. These and other writings demonstrate that also after the composition of the Synoptic Gospels, the Jesus tradition was presented in various literary forms and against different religious and mythological backgrounds before it was stabilized in the biblical manuscripts from the 4th century onwards. Finally, it should be considered that the earthly Jesus tradition from its very beginning was perceived as instructions of a risen Lord, serving as a guideline for ethical orientation of early Christian communities, whereby it was not important in the first place to preserve the teaching of Jesus by heart, but rather to apply its meaning to new situations. It is striking that the sayings of the Lord, not of Jesus, quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 and 9, do not show any traces of the shaping of the synoptic sayings, as for example parallelismus membrorum or chiasm, but instead are formulated by Paul himself as part of larger discourses about marriage and divorce and the rights of an apostle. In these discourses, Paul also formulates his own views on matters related to marriage, divorce, and sexuality, and justifies his freedom not to follow Jesus' commandment of apostolic support from the communities. As Christine Jacobi has shown in her analysis of the analogies between the Synoptic Gospels and Paul's letters, it is more likely that the Jesus tradition was collected and shaped in genres only at a later stage, whereas Paul could quote it freely and even in his own authority as apostle of the risen Lord. The only two exceptions in Paul's letters, the words of institution and the confession formula in 1 Corinthians 15, corroborate this result. In both cases, Paul explicitly states that he quotes a tradition that he has received and passed on. Wherefore, they belong to the pre-Pauline tradition and illustrate their usage in early Christianity. The account of the Last Supper, including the words of institution, in all probability is an etiologic tradition that links the meal of the Christian community to Jesus' Last Supper and explains the meaning of the communal meal as a representation of Jesus' life and death. At an early stage in the transmission process, it was shaped as a tradition containing a reminiscence of the event of the Last Supper and the words of institution. Although the latter are quoted as words of Jesus, in all probability they do not go back to Jesus himself. Rather, the variants in Paul and the Synoptic Gospels reflect a shaping of these words that is aimed at expressing the meaning of this event for the Christian communities. In the celebration of a ritual meal, the communities represent Jesus Christ in their midst. Do this in remembrance of me, and recall his life and death as founding events of their own identity. The formula in 1 Corinthians 15, which for Paul is on the same level as the tradition of the Last Supper, gives a summary of the meaning of Christ's death for our sins, his burial, resurrection, and his appearances as the risen one to the apostles. This shows that for Paul, the activity and teaching of Jesus gained its meaning from a post-Easter perspective. But this is not only the case in Paul's letters, but also in other early Christian writings. The Gospels integrate the Jesus traditions, which they probably received already as shaped in genres and partly gathered in collections, into narratives that depict Jesus' activity and teaching against the background of a conviction that he was the Son of God, who was risen from the dead and exalted to the right hand of God. Also, other early Christian texts share the overall perspective that Jesus acted on earth in God's authority as his representative and was resurrected and exalted after his death, even if the concrete depictions and interpretations of these events have their own peculiarities. These observations indicate that memories of Jesus were perceived and performed in early Christianity as a free and living tradition. Within this process, the Jesus tradition was compiled and formed in genres as for example the Schro, sayings collections, parables, healing stories, and so on, and applied to various situations. These observations make it rather difficult to regard this tradition as learned by heart and transmitted verbatim by his disciples and other eyewitnesses. As mentioned at the beginning, there is also a different understanding of memory in Jesus studies. If I am not mistaken, this approach was introduced for the first time in my book Erinnerung an Jesu Worte from 1997 and subsequently developed in several studies by myself and others. It is this concept to that I shall now turn. Both the act of remembering and the preservation of remembrances do not only have an individual, but also a collective and cultural dimension. This observation was outlined by Maurice Halbwachs and developed further by Jan Assmann. In this perspective, memory is perceived as the common knowledge, the founding tradition, or the formative events of a society or a community. Memory as a cultural phenomenon has to be distinguished from individual recollections, although the latter can be part of a collective memory. But cultural memory, in the first place, means that the past is remembered as a common history of a community or a society. For example, the commemoration of formative events, as the Exodus from Egypt is remembered at Pesach in Judaism until the present, although there is no personal memory of it. Likewise, the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples in Jerusalem is remembered collectively in Christian communities as a founding event, even if there are no personal remembrances of it. For both instances, it is crucial that an event of the past is remembered collectively and that it is represented by a ritual in the community. The meaning of these events for Judaism and Christianity are neither dependent on personal recollections nor on their factuality or veracity. Even if it is likely that only a small group of Hebrews fled from Egypt, even if the words of institution were not spoken by Jesus himself at the Last Supper, these events have a formative meaning in Judaism and Christianity. Memory, perceived as collective and cultural memory, cannot be based on personal recollections and traditions learned by heart. It can also not be restricted to the preservation of remains of the past in archives, libraries, or databases. It encompasses the celebration and actualization of the past in historical narratives, rituals, memorial days, and so forth. Memory as part of the culture of a community, Erinnerungskultur in German, therefore makes aware of the fact that the actual past becomes meaningful only by its interpretation and actualization. This leads to the second part of my paper, in which I will look more closely on memory and concepts of historiography. So the second part is memory and historiography. Historical Jesus research relies on a critical evaluation of the sources about Jesus' activity in his cultural, religious, and political environment. Moreover, Jesus studies since the 90s of the 20th century have considerably enhanced the bulk of material that should be studied for an adequate historical portrait of Jesus. Jewish writings from the Hellenistic Roman period were considered, as well as non-canonical texts from early Christianity and archaeological findings from the Galilee and Judea. The meaning of non-canonical writings for a portrait of Jesus, however, is debated. For the purpose of this paper, it is not necessary to enter into this discussion in more detail. It suffices to note that the inclusion of a broad spectrum of historical sources has underlined that the quest of a historical Jesus has to be pursued under the hermeneutical presuppositions and with the methodological tools of critical historiography. Somewhat ironically, it was the claim at the beginnings of the so-called third quest of a historical Jesus that it would be possible to strip off theological and philosophical concerns in favor of a purely historical approach that has provoked a reconsideration of the hermeneutical and epistemological presuppositions of historical Jesus research. It soon became clear that a historical reconstruction is per se a hermeneutical enterprise defined by epistemological and methodological presuppositions.